if they want to.
And welcome to Let 'Em Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo. We have a great show in store for you. Our guest tonight is Lonnie Harrington, an artist, a musician, an author, and we have his book, Both Sides of the Water, which is a fascinating book. I've begun reading it, and essays on African Native American interactions. And, you know, here's an interesting flag, interesting concept. What's it like to grow up both African American and Native American? And what does that mean and speak for, I imagine, acceptance in both worlds, or either world? Well, thank you, Lonnie, for joining us. And maybe you could begin by telling us a little bit about this book and why you wrote it and what it says.
Well, half jokingly, when I started public speaking in the early 90s, I rarely bowed to peer pressure, but everyone kept saying, write a book, write a book. But then when I got into it, I just realized certain things that used to peeve me over the years, things that weren't talked about in other books. And let me just say as a preface, there are some authors I do respect. But back then, we're talking about the early 90s when I started, actually working on the book. But my research goes back. I started doing research in 1972. And it's over the years, many things that weren't objectively talked about in conversations about interactions. And I felt that being of the heritage, we need to tell our own stories. So it's coming definitely from my perspective based on my own life experiences, but also from research as well.
Mm-hmm. And so tell us a little bit about your background. You were born in...
well, in the old language, Ikanayukska, which means the land blessed by the sun, the moon, and the children of stars. I try to behave myself, but a slaver by the name of Ponce de Leon gets there, and we've been calling it Florida ever since. Mm-hmm. That particular name, though, the term I mentioned is from the Uyachi, the ancient ones, those that came before us in the peninsula. We're in Tallahassee, again, part of that my heritage, Old Town. Through my mother, I'm Seminole and African. Through my father, African, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Shawnee. And I spent part of my boyhood in Florida.
That says a lot about the Native experience right there, because you went through a list of so many, and you were so knowledgeable of each and one of those cultures that make up your ancestors. What was it about American history that led to such a rich ancestry?
Oh, goodness. Well, turmoil. We're talking what I call post-invasion. Well, I look at October 12, 1492 as the jump-off point because we're talking about an event that would trigger a massive escalation of the transatlantic slave trade and the invasion of the hemisphere. So after that particular point in time, the two groups of people came together under crisis conditions throughout the hemisphere. I mean, we can talk about instances of unity as well as instances of divide and conquer. I don't know if we can say 50-50, but it still goes on today. Mm-hmm. Goodness, we see this happening in places like among some communities like the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and even the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, where there's been turmoil about trying to sometime evict, yes, and please quote me, evict some members of the tribe from the tribal roles. Those have tended to be what they call freedmen, which tend to be those largely of African descent.
Right. The Cherokee, for example, had a very interesting and somewhat problematic relationship with African Americans when they were in North Carolina and Georgia.
Well, let's clarify that because, okay, and let me just be quite upfront. If anybody watching, they know how adamant and passionate I can get. I am not excusing slavery, but we have to look at realistically who were the slaveholders among those societies. Even by modern historians' percentages, we're talking about 5 to 6%. And that elite percent, in a prelude to U.S. foreign policy, as far as the U.S. government was concerned, was speaking for the entire nation when nothing could be further from the truth. Now, among indigenous cultures, it's always been, well, if you want to do your thing, cool, we're going over here. But you had a schism between traditionalists, which tended to be more culturally conservative, not liking chattel slavery, versus what's called progressive, I call it perversive, which honestly, let's put right on the table, started to mimic the worst of white aristocratic society of the South at the time. Mm-hmm. That small percentage were the ones were the slaveholders.
With plantations and plantation houses, with the columns and everything, and yet being Cherokee, 100% Cherokee, right?
Yeah, and culturally. And no culture stays static. But if you look at long before the Trail of Tears, 20 years before the Trail of Tears, 1819, 1820, some of the culturally conservative groups like the Chickamaugas headed out west. Ended up in places like Arkansas and what's called Indian Territory as well, but also headed back into Texas. I don't have time to go into Cherokee history right now, but there is, among the oral history, talk about Cherokees originally coming out of places like Mexico and Texas, heading up into the Carolinas, one of many creation stories. But again, long before that's, like I said, before the Trail of Tears, you did have some culturally conservatives that wanted to have nothing to do with what the quote-unquote progressives were doing. In the meantime, though over years, you had bloodshed break out, not only among the Cherokees, we see it among the Creeks as well, even among the Choctaws and Chickasaws, where these factions went to bloodshed over not just slavery but other things as well.
Well, Andrew Jackson had a hand in some of that.
Oh man, he was our Hitler. You got me awake, Paul. Okay.
Andrew Jackson was the 8th president of the United States?
I can't tell you exactly there, but
he's one of the single-digit presidents, but he's on the $20 bill, and he was a very popular president at that time. But
among some.
Yeah, among the Tennesseans and the white, slave-owning population.
Well, to some of us, he's the personification of evil. Although I wasn't raised in a reservation community as a boy, my mother used to take me to reservations. Certainly now I've been in touch with, over the years, many relatives in the tribal sense. There's still oral history about what this man made our communities go through.
Right.
Starting from, the 18 teens, well up until the time of the 1830s.
I'm too poor to have a $20 bill on me, or else I'd show you his picture.
Oh, believe me, I've got one in my, I hate it when I look at 20s, I've got one in my wallet.
Right, it's very interesting. So, what is the title, Both Sides of the Water? What exactly is the meaning of that title?
To me, it signifies my ancestry, because I can trace my ancestry not only to Africa, but as well as here, Turtle Island, which is what many of the folks indigenous here call North America. If we start going into the Caribbean, or most of the land of the Condor in parts of South America, our Mexica/Aztec relatives and Mayans would call their area, they believe they're in the back of a crocodile. But up here it's believed we're in the back of a turtle.
So it's related, and seafaring folks. Do you hold any of the stories that seafaring folks from the west coast of Africa might have actually come?
Oh, goodness, the evidence is all there. As a matter of fact, I talk about in the books, the United States government, while not acknowledging it outright, they acknowledge the possibility in its 1894 census done by the Department of the Interior, and I hate this term, of the 5 civilized tribes in Indian Territory, which is now present-day Oklahoma, when they looked at divisions of the Creek Confederacy, and specifically the Yamasee, and I'm quoting now, believed to be descendant of shipwrecked African sailors and Indian women. Now, we can go back and forth of whether these voyages happened by accident or intentionally, but yeah, there was contact. But goodness, Columbus wasn't even the first white guy here.
And little known is that from West Africa were some of the world's greatest mariners.
Yeah,
historic boat builders and mariners. People talk about Columbus and the Spanish and Italians and Portuguese, but Africans were also great sailors. And
plus, whether you liked it or not, especially given the technology of the day, if you got caught up in those currents, and this has happened elsewhere, you were going someplace. Our relatives in the Pacific learned how to definitely master those currents. Thus, the islands in the Pacific became populated. But around the world, you see these currents, and if you're talking about wind power or sail power, you get caught up in that, you're gone. Now, interestingly enough, not only we can look at Africans coming here, but there is evidence of indigenous people from this hemisphere ending up in parts of Africa and Europe before 1492 as well. Now, we can debate whether it happened by accident or intentionally, but I would recommend a work, for example, by the late respected brother Jack Forbes, The American Discovery of Europe, which looks at specifically at evidence along those lines.
How do these various tribes and nations, is there a unified way of deciding who is enrolled member and who is a part of that tribe, or is it like a catch as catch can, each group has their own rules?
Well, the phrase, it's complicated. In terms of enrollment, contemporarily, sometimes folks rely on quote-unquote blood quantum, and blood quantum is a very ticklish, and I'm being polite, subject in indigenous communities in the United States. Among some traditionalists, if you're trace the line through your mother, as far as they're concerned, you're of the people. Fine, but you may not necessarily be tribally enrolled because of politics. Unfortunately, right now, we see a lot of ugly things happening in the United States and people being kicked off the tribal rolls for any number of reasons. It's gotten to be quite ugly.
How did that come to be, this whole movement to remove people? How long has this been going on, and where is it happening mostly?
Well, I don't know if I can fairly say where it's happening mostly, but we've seen efforts happen in places such as Oklahoma, but I'm not just going to pick on Oklahoma. We've seen it happening in California as well, Pacific Northwest as well. Interestingly enough, and I want to tie in with something right here, we were saying a few moments ago, I attended a symposium at the National Museum of the American Indian in January 2010, I believe. And an Ojibwe woman who was on the panel said she was in a dilemma because some of her nieces and nephews were not enrolled, but traditionally it was her role as an aunt to teach them the culture. So they're being raised culturally Ojibwe, but they're not tribally enrolled. So we see dynamics like that happening throughout North America.
Is that politics, so that certain factions don't get more votes within the tribal elections and things like that?
There's no one size fits all, but yeah. Making a long story short, yeah.
All right. And you know, how about in the? What are some areas that are? What are some of the nations that are more expansive?
Now, when you say expansive, specifically, what do you mean?
Specifically, don't make these like blood quantum type decisions, but just allow people to come in based on marriage, based on adoption of culture.
Again, it's complicated. For example, I know folks that aren't enrolled, but they have clan ties. Still among some of the societies, if you know your clan, that's very prevalent. So I would say if you know your clan, sometimes you're still welcome, although you might not necessarily be enrolled. And I know certainly among the Seminole tribe of Florida right now, from what I understand, you have some folks that are clanless down there now among the tribe, but some folks are coming around saying, well, they're part of our tribe now. 20, 30 years ago, if you were clanless, that put you in a very precarious position socially speaking.
You have to know where you came from in the tribe. You could say wolf or depending on the group, you know.
Yeah, or
rabbit or whatever it is.
Or who your grandparents are. Certainly when I went back as an adult to visit the Seminole tribe of Florida, the Hollywood Reservation, I just happened to mention somebody who my grandmother was. Just so that folks know who I am. I'm not claiming to be enrolled, and I'm certainly not. But hey, this is me, and it's I haven't been here. I used to play here as a kid. So, making a long story short.
Right. So that's interesting. So, what are the roots of? Because there's a complicated history between African Americans, blacks, and Indians. I mean, because there was Buffalo Soldiers or Indian fighters among African Americans. There were.
Can we get back to divide and conquer?
Yes.
Yes. And in all fairness, let me just say right now, on my father's side of the family, my great-great-grandfather, William Roscoe Harrington, was in the 10th Cavalry. He was at San Juan Hill in Cuba. And yes, folks, the Buffalo Soldiers took that hill. But let me calm down. Teddy Roosevelt came up afterwards. Be that as it may. I'm not saying it's right, but that's a good example of divide and conquer, how in this particular instance, primarily African-descended men fought Native peoples. But interestingly enough, and I talk about it in the book, it wasn't always the case. I talk about an instance, I believe, in 1883 in Colorado, where a group of the 9th Cavalry actually protected a group of Utes from white Colorado militia who wanted to do them in. Again, we get into this gray area, and I certainly know, and I'm not excusing the whole divide and conquer and the fighting thing, but sometimes it's a bit more complicated. Certainly in terms of my Seminole heritage, and I respect our grandfathers, but we look at the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts as another example. Our grandfathers were talked into coming out of Mexico to fight on behalf of the government. Never got the land they were promised, by the way, but again, we talk about divide and conquer. But the same thing happened also throughout the hemisphere, where you have quote-unquote Native men going after escaped slaves who weren't always black, by the way. But yeah, it goes on, as well as you had different Native peoples going after each other. Among the Apaches, we see this a lot. Especially during the late 1800s, different groups of Apaches were played off against each other. Right. Not exclusively among them, but as one example.
So let's go back to Seminole. Seminole are one of the nations that have never been, or tribes that have never been officially conquered.
No, and interestingly enough, the United States government officially declared an end to hostilities in 1972.
Really?
Although the shooting stopped from the last Seminole War in 1858. Which is
it's like Korea, North Korea, right? It was like an undeclared war.
It's interesting because as a child, my grandmother used to not permit my mother to go visit any of our Seminole relatives, although she would still do it. Her stepfather also was of Seminole ancestry, who basically told her, well, if you get caught by your mother, I don't know anything. But as now, in all due respect to grandmama, who's long gone, but I wonder if that had something to do with it, because there was still maybe, are they going to send you off to Oklahoma? Are you going to get shot?
Right.
Although they shoot us anyway, but
there might be still resistance down there in some remote corners of Florida.
Well, Florida has a history of acting crazy right now too, but that's a whole other show you could do. Certainly.
Right, Bob. Well, that's interesting. So the Seminole people, how did they? They retreated basically into the Florida Peninsula to escape the army when they were conquering Georgia and all these places.
Again, it's complicated. It was a succession of things. We didn't initially call ourselves Seminoles. We were still calling ourselves by our different town names. But yeah, over a succession from the 1750s on, various groups came into the peninsula, occupying lands. The Uiachi, those that have been there before, is people like the Apalache, the Timoqua, the Tequesta, the Calusa. Although some say we actually intermarried with some of the remnants of those folks. But yeah, over a period of time, mentioned Andrew Jackson, at different points, social upheaval continued to push us further and further south into the peninsula. Those of us that weren't killed or enslaved, or some of us escaped to the Bahamas, some went to Cuba. Making a long story short, later on, some other folks would end up in Mexico. But again, making a long story short, we were actually, through a series of social upheavals, the wars continually pushed further and further down into the peninsula.
So did did slaves actually escape into Florida and join with the Seminole Nation? Is that what happened?
All of the above. Not only that, pre-Seminole era, but when folks started interacting during the Spanish period, you had Africans that occupied different stratus in Spanish society. Some had intermarried with indigenous women. Some had ended up being adopted in some indigenous communities. You had that particular interaction. You know, I talked about the Yamasee before. You had some Yamasee coming out of the Carolinas into what is now Florida, setting up the settlements. And then, you know, escaping slaves as well. Some of our Gullah Geechee relatives played into that over a period of years.
Wow, there's all these. Are these town names or what? Are these names? I've never even heard of some of these names.
Well, Gullah Geechee are actually named of peoples. They those relatives still occupy some of the islands off of Georgia. But if you start talking
like
about
the Sea Islands?
Yes, definitely.
Where people have the interesting forms of the English language that are studied from all over the world. What do you think of anthropologists?
Some of my best friends are anthropologists. I try to keep an open mind, but you're very glad I drink decaf. There's a fine line between objective research and, quote me, grave robbing. So some things that have been done in the past, I have no use for. I think it's just desecration. On the other hand, I've met individuals over the years, and not that I'm getting soft, but I've made an honest objective to at least approach their research material in a respectful way. I think we need more of those if you're going to, because the field's not going anywhere whether we like it or not. And also when we start getting more anthropologists of color which have cultural sensitivities, I think a lot of the abuses we've seen in the past won't be as prevalent.
Such as Kennewick Man, which is the famous story where you know, the bones were it's almost like put on an exhibit. I mean, and shown to the world and to the great consternation of the people there in that region.
Yes, and
along
unfortunately,
the Columbia River.
Yeah, but that's not an isolated example. We see that happening all over the world to indigenous peoples, no matter where you're from. It seems the bones of the ancestors being shown, you know, sites being desecrated all the time.
How should they deal when things are discovered? Like recently, a dam. There's a dam failure. They had to draw down the lake behind the dam, and ancient sites. I mean, some of them possibly thousands of years old. You know, were exposed. How should they deal with that when things like that happen? In your opinion?
If I were in that particular situation, I would approach the local indigenous communities. That would be the first thing I do. Well, actually, I'd be obligated to do that as being an indigenous man myself.
And there's laws that require that now, I think.
The
federal laws.
Yeah, there's federal laws as well. But I'm just saying culturally, if I came upon something like that, my first reaction would be to try to contact the local communities and make them aware of what, you know, the findings, if you will.
What about the history of the told tale that people, you know, Native Americans are people who came over the Bering Straits 13,000 years ago?
Well, let's get something straight right now.
The traditional story that we're sold.
Some folks came over there, but not everybody. And we look at scientists, look at your own documentation, okay? We look at cave drawings going back 40, 50,000 years, long before the Bering Straits. Okay, we're not talking about graffiti here. Somebody put those up there. Okay, and yeah, this gets to be a sore point because, yes, some folks did come over there, but not everybody. Creation stories of different people certainly talk about, you know, going back much, much further than that. You know, 35, 40,000, in some instances 50,000 years. So you look at your own, you know, look at your own methods. Come on, folks. Again, you're glad I drink decaf.
That's great. You can talk about it as much as you want. I find it fascinating that we're talking about it. Tell me, essays on African Native American interactions. Tell me about what are some of the key talking points when it comes to interactions between Native American people. And
if I can be so bold, let me read a passage real quick from that.
Absolutely. And tell them this is available Rose Dog Books at the back here, and
primarily online right now. But some of my friends on the Powwow Trail sell it. But yeah, rosedog.com,
so
Amazon.com, and
American Indian Community House. Let's do a shout out for them because one of the reasons you're here is because Marcia and folks from the Community House got in touch with me and said you'd be a great guest, and you are a great guest. Thanks for coming on Let Them Talk. Lonnie Harrington, who is joining us and talking about his experiences as a person of extremely diverse background. Right, among the folks at the heart of our society and our culture here in America, you know, Native American people, African American people here from the very beginning.
I wanted to read a quote. It's the quote I was allowed to use from the James Baldwin estate. This is from his work, No Name in the Street, and this sets the context for the book. Both continents, Africa and America, be it remembered, were discovered. What a wealth of arrogance that little word contains, with devastating results for the indigenous populations, whose only human use thereafter was a source of capital for white people. On both continents, the white and dark gods met in combat. and it is on this outcome of this, and it is on the outcome of this combat that the future of both continents depends. I make a point in here, and I talk about the real moves to grab the land of Africa. Didn't start until after the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference, when all the European countries with the United States in the background split up Africa and decide who they're going to take. Now, interestingly enough, recently I came upon some work where they're saying, oh no, they didn't split them up. We're talking about free markets. Well, hey, you set the grounds for the invasions. But my point being, by the time that happened, the different European powers were looking at different models around the world. They'd have the military models, the divide and conquer models, to actually move on Africa. Certainly Africa had been victimized in terms of the slave trade over centuries, but with the exception of what the Dutch did in 1638, we don't see any real moves inland until after what happened at the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. Some of the models they used were based on what they did here in the Americas, in Asia to a certain degree as well.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think, how should American society, I think there's been some changes. I mean, the American government and the economic system have not changed for the better, really. They've gotten worse. But there have been some changes in attitudes among the American people. I mean, I think things like what happened in 1972 at the Academy Awards when millions of people saw, the speech that told them about what was happening at Wounded Knee, and the American Indian movement, the work that they did, Leonard Peltier. I mean, there's been a sea change, I think, in general public's attitude towards Native people. They want to see them get some justice. We always wonder, what can we do? What can people do? How can other, the rest of us who for good or, ill or good, also live here, how can we honor the indigenous people and people who've been here for a lot longer,
Well, to paraphrase Otis Redding and Aretha Franklin, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, respect. Respect goes a long way. And honestly, see what you can do among your own communities that can be in true alliance with the different struggles. I say this, though, in terms of the struggles on the planet right now, pick your struggle because they're all important. Social injustice, yes. What's happening environmentally, yes, sometimes they're intertwined. Well, as a matter of fact, as our relation, some of our relatives say, Mitakuye Yasin, we're all related, and all of this is related. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's always something you can do. You can't do everything, but you can do something. Mm-hmm. But go about it in a respectful manner.
Right. So, it's not all about just making money, It's a time, people have to make time to do something, to give back, because there's a lot has been taken, from the Native people who were here. African American people were taken from their homes, ripped out of the womb of their own homes and taken here to America to be enslaved. Native people were pushed from their homes and driven to four corners of the continent and stripped of their identity for hundreds of years, and only now are getting some ability to get that identity back. How do you think Native identity is going to develop in the future? Especially this Native African, because I think that you have something here that's going to grow in recognition. More and more people, for better or for ill, are identifying themselves as Native American. Just look at the census; it's going up. People want to be Native American. They look at their history and they say, "I have a grandmother who was Cherokee. I have somebody who was in my family who was Lakota or something," and I'm going to go on the census and say I'm Native American. Now all of a sudden we have millions of people saying they're Native American.
Okay, well, who are you culturally? But again, I go back to saying respect. The whole Cherokee princess thing, and that's a lot, a laugh.
And how about the, people, some of them mean well, but, they wear Indian, they play drums, they wear Indian, but they're not Indian at all. Not even one slightest bit, but they identify so much with we've had folks on here played Indian flute. He was a white guy, 100% white guy, never lived out west. He just was very good at it. And he said, yeah, I get guff sometimes for doing that because it's a sacred flute. What am I doing playing it? But I love playing it. I'm going to continue playing it. What do you think about those kind of things?
Well, if it's a sacred flute, he should not be playing it. Mm-hmm. Your proper way of going about it is try to apprentice yourself to someone who will then give you permission. Now, I've been a singer and dancer on the Powwow Trail in the Northeast for many years. I've been honored at times to have done ceremonies, but only when I've been invited to do so. Now, as a singer, there's certain songs I will not sing because I have not been given permission to sing them. There's certain things I won't talk about because I don't have permission to do that. Okay. Mm-hmm. So this gentleman might be quite good at the flute, but if he really had this sense of respect, and he might be a very sincere individual, but if it's a sacred flute, did you have permission to learn on that? No, you would not go into a cathedral and start any mess like that. You would not go into a synagogue. You would not go into a mosque.
Right. Well, what about you know? Let me touch the last few minutes of the show. We touch on some of the other issues. You know, racist stereotyping as far as mascots of sports teams. You know, use of alcohol bottles. You know, using as trademarks and things like that. You don't see that so much. But there was a time when there was. You know, they were selling Crazy Horse beer and things like that. You saw that everywhere. Maybe not, you know, slightly related, not exactly the same thing, but, you know, well-meaning white people who just, like, go around and act like they're Indians, make believe that they're Indians, and speak as if they go, ho, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, what do you think of that? Is that diluting at all, the culture at all?
Well, it's some of it is insulting.
Yeah.
I know the phrase you just used, some of our Plains relatives, you know, would look at, actually I had some Plains relatives that might end up at Rikers Island because some folks aren't as patient anymore. Again, it gets back to respect. I would not approach someone else's culture and try to take it away saying, I know all about it. No. I might talk with someone of the culture, seeing what is permissible and what isn't. But no, I like to think I've got a sense of respect. Same thing, you know, look at it the other way. Have some respect for someone else's culture.
Right. What do you think about these folks, these sports teams? What should they, I mean, they're really being recalcitrant. I won't even say the names because people find them offensive even to say them.
It is offensive.
You know,
it's plain and simple. It's offensive. And now this whole thing, I understand the guy in Washington who owns that team wants to try to buy off some of the communities. Oh, come on. Please. Give me a break. You know, it's and there's no excuse for that.
They should just change their names already.
Yeah. You know, and some teams have done that. You know, St. John's University did that as one example. Hey, come on. If you want to talk about respect, you know, walk the walk. You know, there's no excuse for that in this day and age. No excuse whatsoever.
All right. How about presentations in film and things like that? Do you think Hollywood's gotten better or worse? Or
I call it Holly weird. I do like now that more independent films done by, you know, native film directors and producers are coming out. There's still a long way to go. Right. Still definitely a long way to go.
Right. And so do you think there should be more realism, or what type of films should Hollywood make, or should filmmakers make, you know, about Native Americans? What direction do you think they should go in?
Well, when you say realism, you're talking about history. Yeah, it should be realistic. But, you know, there's also an entertainment thing. But again, I go back to respect. I'm sounding redundant.
Right.
Again, don't cross certain lines.
Yeah. What are those lines? Give me one of them.
Oh, goodness. Some folks walk around in headdresses. No. Plains headdresses. No. Only members of the community that have been honored are entitled to wear that.
Lonnie Harrington, thank you for joining us on Let Them Talk. It's been a great show. This is the book here, and I just give it to everybody to see. It's called Both Sides of the Water, and just check out the next powwow and pick one up.
Yeah, which is actually April 12th at the National Museum of the American Indian, 7 to 10, and then April 19th at Columbia University, Rue Knowledge Auditorium, 12 to 6.